for those of you in the room, we are waiting to go on live online, which is why there's sort of odd silence while we wait to see what happens. I need to wait for the signal from the back to say that we're online. Is that better? Okay. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure to welcome you in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
The minutes of the ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London held on Thursday, 27th October 2022. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the extraordinary general meeting and ordinary meeting, both of Thursday, 20th October 2022, were read and signed. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society in order to be suspended in the usual manner. The following communication was then laid before the Society: Louis XIV, patron, collector, creator, by Dr. Philip Mansfield. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, 3rd of November 22, then adjourned the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as true and complete record? Thank you. Following the results of today's ballot, I declare the following duly elected fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London: Marcus Imone, Lee Alston, Catherine Barnett, Cornelius Barton, Christian Crimmins, Ross Cook, Roger Curtis, Susan Gosh, Colin Guy Gilbert Hunt, James John Morley, Carolyn Putney, Michael Sutherland, and Ravenna Yanish, the latter being our recently nominated fellow from Ukraine, which I'm glad to welcome to the fellowship. Certificates.
Thank you. I could just remind fellows, I'm reading the shortened version of the certificates, and there's more online if you want to read it. Christopher Lionel Edwards, MA, antiquarian bookseller with interests in manuscripts, a member of various bibliographical societies in the UK and the USA. Ken Edmund, MA, PhD, head of research funding at the British Academy, with expertise in Scottish history, especially in the 1500s. Devon Fitzgerald, PhD, curator of rare books and history of printing at UCLA, with specialist expertise in East Asia and Western books. Anna Garnett, BA, MA, PhD, curator at the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology at UCL, and honorary fellow at the University of Liverpool. Toby Jones, BA, MA, PhD, a nautical archaeologist and curator of the Newport medieval ship. Christina Kravich, BA, MPhil, head of geoarchaeology at York Archaeology, with interests in the exploitation of wetlands in the Holocene. John Stephen Lee, BA, MA, PhD, strategic planning officer at North Yorkshire County Council, with interests in medieval urban development, funerary monuments, and the cloth industry. Tamsin Christina O'Connell, BA, DPhil, a reader in archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and a leader in the application of isotope studies in archaeology.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our lecture. The lecturer this evening, Dr. Rob Collins, FSA, is Senior Lecturer in Archaeology at Newcastle University, and over recent years has been Project Manager for the lottery-funded Hadrian's Wall Community Archaeology project, about which he's going to talk to us this evening. Rob completed his PhD in Archaeology at the University of York, and prior to joining Newcastle University, worked for the Cultural Antiquities Scheme as Finds Liaison Officer for North East England. His research is focused on concepts of transition and change, with particular interest in the late Roman to early medieval transition, frontiers, and material culture. In practice, Rob works on Hadrian's Wall, has published extensively on the topic, including his book Hadrian's Wall and the End of Empire from Routledge, and the following Finds from the Frontier with our fellow Lindsay Alison Jones. More recently, he's joined a distinguished line of editors of the Handbook to the Pilgrimage to Hadrian's Wall for 2019 with our fellow Matt Simmons, who's with us here this evening. He's also trustee of the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle upon Tyne, a corresponding member of the German Archaeological Institute, serves as the chair of the Archaeological Research Group of the Hadrian's Wall Partnership Group. He's lecturing to us this evening on the HLF project, WallCAP, Hadrian's Wall, the intersection of conservation, research and engagement. Please welcome Greg.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here this evening. And I'd also like to especially thank Annabelle for her assistance and patience as the train strikes went on and were canceled and then delayed to make sure that this lecture could go forward tonight. I'll be speaking about the Hadrian's Wall Community Archaeology Project, WallCAP. And one of the things I'd just like to point out at the beginning is the majority of images are those of ourselves on the project or otherwise belong to Newcastle University, and any other images shown that aren't ours, there's a little attribution there so that you know who to appropriately credit for those. WallCAP, as I said, is short for the Hadrian's Wall Community Archaeology Project. This was funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and hosted by Newcastle University. As a community archaeology project, we had three very broad but important aims that also linked us to different audiences, but also different activities and different outputs. However, they all intersected within one project. So at one level, we wanted to address pressing concerns around management and conservation, things that had been recurring issue or long-standing issue along Hadrian's Wall for many years, in some instances, actually decades, which our various heritage agencies in the North have, for all sorts of very valid reasons, have had difficulties addressing. The other is, of course, as an archaeologist, I'm always happy to do some more digging on Hadrian's Wall. There's always more to learn. And because it's such a large monument, there's actually quite a bit that we've not investigated directly archaeologically, or other questions that, of course, get raised by previous excavations. So there's always more to understand through that archaeology. But the other aspect is that because Hadrian's Wall is a World Heritage Site, there is this ongoing concern and importance of local community engagement. And that's to make sure that those local communities are aware of the value of that heritage on their doorstep, and that it doesn't become a barrier to their own local existence and local enjoyment. As you can imagine, any place that sees lots of tourists can sometimes be a hindrance to local residents. And for anyone who's grown up with a monument like that in their backyard, it's also very easy to take it for granted without ever actually really having understood it or been taught about it. And so to ensure that that World Heritage endures, it was important that we engage those local communities. So I'll briefly talk about the project a little bit, just so you get a sense of what we've done and how we've accomplished it. There's been a reasonably large team dedicated to the project, with myself as the project manager, but we had dedicated staffing in community liaison and volunteer coordination. That's Carrie Shaw. And she also had a support officer who also helped with some of the administrative elements of the project. We then had someone who was focused on a lot of the digital processing for all the survey work that we did. We had a project support officer who actually had to work across all elements of the project. We then had a community archaeologist who led on a lot of the archaeological fieldwork and excavation. And we had a community geologist, because actually a lot of the geology is something we built into the project as well. And a lot of the work to meet those three key aims was focused across two different strands, two primary strands. One was heritage at risk, and that was very much to investigate and understand those factors that are adversely affecting the wall in terms of its conservation and ongoing preservation. We were also, within heritage at risk, targeting sites that were on the Historic England Heritage at Risk Register to see if we could better understand the risks or ideally remove them from that register. And for those sites we couldn't remove from the register, at least provide better information on the nature of the threats and offer possible solutions. And within that, we could then take priority conservation on those sites most at risk. The stone sourcing and dispersal strand is a little bit more complicated, because actually what that strand was meant to do was think about the very long life of Hadrian's Wall. Think of it in that notion of a life cycle, and trace the wall from its source geology, which is hundreds of millions of years, up to actually the reuse and recycling of its fabric, which continues to happen to the very present. And so it was that cycle of where does the stone come from and where does the stone end up if it's not still within the wall itself. And what I'll do over the rest of the lecture is look at those two strands in turn. So we'll take a few moments to talk about heritage at risk and some of the sites we investigated, and then we'll also then look at the stone sourcing and dispersal work we've done. Now, the project was very large, very long. Because of COVID, it had an extension, so it was originally planned to be 4 years in its delivery. It ended up being closer to 5. But Lottery have been fantastic and great as a funder, actually. And one of the things I should say is that COVID has been a challenge for many organizations in the heritage sector. It was for our project as well, but what it also did was allow us to experiment with more digital provision. And thankfully, due to that staffing that I showed you on the last slide in kind of building digital in from the beginning, it meant during COVID, we were able to make a digital pivot so that COVID didn't affect us as adversely as it really could have. And so that's one of the lessons actually that I would highlight going forward for all of us to think about as we design future projects and we have to take global pandemics into account. We worked at a number of sites across the project, across the two strands, more than 30 sites. And there's overlapping of work at some sites between those two strands. So you can see here in purple, those sites that are heritage at risk, in red, those sites that are stone sourcing dispersal, and then in yellow, those sites that contributed to both heritage at risk and stone sourcing dispersal work. The red are more numerous, and actually that site work was often much easier because it was really just geological sampling, for example. So it wasn't extensive excavations by any means. But one of the key things here, as you can see, is that we wanted to have geographical parity across the entire World Heritage Site. We might be based at Newcastle University at the east end of the wall, but it's very important that we represented the entirety of the World Heritage Site and not just the bits that were convenient to us in Newcastle. So the heritage at risk sites that I'll speak about tonight are Hidden on the Wall, Peel Gap, Walltown Crags, Cambeck, and Port Carlisle. I'll actually run through them in a slightly different order, but this is the map that shows you where they are. If you're not intimately familiar with the geography of Hadrian's Wall, I would ask that you just try to keep this notion in mind of broadly where those sites are located, whether it's kind of at the east end of the wall, in the central sector, or in the western sector. So Steel Rig is a great example of some of the work we want to do to target heritage at risk. This wasn't a site that required further excavation. A lot of work was done here in the central sector by Jim Crow in the late 80s and 90s, working for the National Trust. The problem here, as you can see in the image on the left, is actually rather recurring collapse of the facing stones of the wall, the collapse of that fabric. And the reason that happens is you can hopefully see along the top of the wall here, a well-worn path where people are walking along the top of the wall curtain. It's perfectly understandable and natural that people would want to do that, but actually that pushes a lot of pressure on the internal fabric of the wall and forces the collapse of those stones. So the challenge here was literally rebuilding some of that facing stone, but also trying to address the issue of people mounting the wall. And so the repair work was relatively easy at the few locations where there were collapses. It was, a day to maybe 2 days of work at any one site, so relatively straightforward. The greater challenge was, how do you politely tell people to get off our wall, as it were? And the solution we arrived at was to look at those access points, those locations where people could more easily step onto the top of the wall. And so that image on the right is a good example of what we were able to do. You have the line of Hadrian's wall coming up into a modern field wall, and you're seeing it from the point of view of Hadrian's wall. Actually, on the other side of that field wall is a road. And it was, a mere, third of a meter step up from some turf up to the top of the wall. And that was the case in other locations along the stretch here at Steel Rig. So one of the things we did was, in some points, we could raise, say, field wall boundaries to just make it clear, do not cross. In other locations, we also raised the profile of the top of the wall. So we put wall core stones, kind of rough angular rubble, and just rearranged them slightly so they didn't fit flat and flush. And then turf hatched between those stones to secure them in place. But to create a natural looking appearance that also is good for the preservation of the fabric of the wall, but also is very unwelcoming to stepping and walking on it. So it's very clear you would break your ankle if you try to walk along that path. It would be impossible to do this along the entire length of Hadrian's wall, but actually this becomes a very viable strategy in those locations where people are able to access the top of it, and reasonably cheap as well. So this is a very good example of the sort of work that we were able to do and offer some very viable problem solving and solutions to the various stakeholders in the wall. There were other issues at other sites. At Port Carlisle, which was our westernmost site along Hadrian's wall, you have the survival of the wall curtain that's been known here for not just decades, but centuries. You can see the two images on the right by Irwin Coates from 1877, 1881, which shows kind of the wall preserved in a historic hedge. And the image there on the lower left-hand side showing you the modern field gate, which actually is using a break in Hadrian's wall for access between fields. The difficulty here, to quote the farmer, is that the gate stays the same size, but the tractors keep getting bigger. And what has happened over the decades as those tractors have gotten bigger is it's continued to knock the stones of the wall. So it's scuffed them, it's broken them, it's shattered them, it's knocked them out of position. And in the western sector of Hadrian's wall, there's very little upstanding wall surviving. So actually this stretch is deemed very important. And so this was something that's been known about for years, but no one's been able to really dedicate the amount of time administratively that it required to solve the problem. However, that's one of the things we were able to do. So we looked at old maps, we spoke with the farmer. It turns out that where the red arrow is pointing is where the modern field gate is. But according to the OS 1970 map, there was a farm outbuilding that actually spanned across the wall, and the wall must have been destroyed there because the building was flush with ground level. So that gave us a target place that we could relocate a new gate to that would then not disturb the wall going forward. And so that's what we did. We did an exploratory assessment and investigation field work there at the site of that outbuilding. We did another very small trench here along the line of the curtain where there appeared to be facing stones in situ. And then we cleaned and recorded those bits of Hadrian's wall that were still upstanding. What we found was actually almost nothing. Rather disappointingly, this was the first trench I got to open on Hadrian's wall in the project, and I did not find Hadrian's wall. What I found was Victorian rubbish reconstituted to look like Hadrian's wall. So slightly disappointing, but also actually very insightful for understanding the history of the wall in modern centuries. Here at the west end of Hadrian's wall, you have a lot of flat salt marsh. And what you have is centuries, and I do mean centuries, going back at least 1,000 years of landscape management of flood defenses. And this is quite interesting. So there are things we were looking for in the geophysics, for example, which you can see on the left. We were looking for any traces of the ditch to the north of the wall. It was very hard to pick up, and it requires a little bit of the eye of faith to see it in the resistivity. It is kind of there, but it's actually probably quite reasonably well filled. And if you consider flood action recurring year after year, decade after decade, century after century, that ditch is filling up with the same kind of silt, which makes up the underlying field soil anyways. And when we excavated the trench, we did find wall fabric, but it was not in situ. It was not structured. It had been sorted and recomposed, not just once, but probably any number of times. And so in fact, what we found about the wall here is that the only bit of the wall that really can be confidently said to have survived in situ as Roman archaeology is the bit where the farm gate was. And ironically, it was the farm gate that has preserved the fabric of the wall there because it fossilized access between the fields in a way that the actual line of the wall didn't, and was reworked considerably over the years. That said, we were able to clean back the vegetation, properly record it, both in traditional and digital fashions, and now fenced off so people aren't accessing it, and also the cows aren't further destroying it, because the cows have been another feature of wall irritation in this bit. Another interesting site where we can't necessarily solve a problem, and I'm not sure it's correct to say it's a problem, and this is a stretch of Hadrian's Wall between the villages of Throckley and Hedden on the Wall to the west of Newcastle. The wall itself runs under the road that you can see here in this Google Earth image. And the vallum, the earthwork feature that lies to the south of the wall, has a very large monumental ditch. And it's in varying states of preservation across the three fields between the two villages. Our work focused on the easternmost field where the ditch and the mound features of the vallum were most worn away and degraded. Now, as you can see from the photos, that's under arable agriculture. But, there's very little that we can do to necessarily stop that agriculture, and it wouldn't necessarily be correct to stop the agriculture either. But one of the things that we could try and determine is how much of the vallum as an earthwork feature of the wall survives. So we excavated a 40-meter long by 2-meter wide trench across the vallum, and you can see a section of that across the top. The colored bits showing you where the northern mound of the vallum is, the central ditch, and then the southern mound of the vallum. And as you can see, there is a slight south slope to the land here as well. So there's a natural slope issue alongside that of decades of arable agriculture. What we could see was intentional infill of the vallum ditch, and actually we were able to get some appropriate samples for a C14 date for that, and that puts it broadly in the late 12th to early 13th century, which fits in with kind of the medieval village expansion in this part of England, and that you see across the rest of England. So actually what we can see here is actually some of the first intentional demolition of wall features. So this allows us to make some recommendations because actually we can compare the results that we have from this easternmost field where the vallum is most destroyed to the westernmost field, which is actually in pasture and where it's upstanding to very good preservation, and show the difference that, say, 40 years of agriculture will make, of arable agriculture, that will make to an earthwork monument. Now, to get a little bit more interesting, I'm going to take you into the central sector, Walltown Crags, and that was the site that I also had as the cover slide. The issue here is actually one of Mother Nature. The wall, as it's positioned, is at the top of a 30 to 40 meter cliff face. It's also been, shall we say, interfered with by early 20th century blasting, dynamiting for quarry work to take this wonderfully hard volcanic basalt and use it. So some of the stone from this part of the wall is actually, I think, in the Liverpool Keys because it's such good hard-wearing stone. But you can see from the image on the left that the wall is going right up to a cliff face. And so there's concern here about just climate change and natural erosion that would be almost impossible to stop. We can't predict when a cliff face will shear and take away a monument. And so the work here was to partly record and preserve by recording, preservation by recording, but also to challenge and test some earlier excavations. So there were some Edwardian excavations at the site around 1912, 1913, but no detailed record, really just a couple lines saying the wall was excavated here and this is what we found. You can see in the image in the top left, the Edwardian trench, about 3 spades wide, where they basically removed the soil from the back of the wall. You can see their spoil mound running in a very nice linear fashion. And so what we're able to do was excavate here in trench 2, so that's the image just here on the lower left, re-excavate one of those Edwardian trenches, see what they found. And then we also put a trench at the end of the Edwardian trench to look at what the wall would have looked like when the Edwardians explored it. So what's the difference of a century of weathering is the question here. There are things that you can see right away. When it was originally excavated by the Edwardians, the course of the wall was higher, at least 2 to 3 courses of stonework higher. There's been some collapse over the years in that sense, leaving these core stones more exposed and more prone to erosion. Whereas if you look at trench 1 where we excavated, you've got much greater depth of preservation. On the south face, the north face, however, has suffered much more collapse naturally down the crag side. What this allowed us to do, however, though, especially in trench 1, is we were able to look at and compose a general history of the wall's kind of condition across the centuries. So we were able to identify the original Roman excavation to reveal the bedrock, to build the wall directly on top of that bedrock, the Roman ground surface, subsequent, we assume, post-Roman collapse. Sadly, there was no material from this that we could date by carbon dating. And then there was further collapse. And this layer here links to the Edwardian excavations. So we can see that actually those excavations presented further collapse in the immediate vicinity. And then, of course, more recent ground soil conditions and turf developing on top of that. That allowed us to build up a more phased appreciation of what the wall may have looked like in terms of the course of collapse and ruination over the centuries. Now, I should emphasize that this is in the central sector on a rather distant crag. We're not near a major population center. And so this is a projected hypothesis at best, but also one which applies to a more distant rural area. This sort of model is less likely to be applicable in a place like Newcastle. We have urban expansion throughout the Middle Ages and into the present day. The last site I'll look at, the heritage at risk section, is at Cambeck, which is just north of the fort of Castlesteads. So we're at that interface between the western sector and the central sector. The fort of Castlesteads is marked here in orange. And we're looking at where the wall crosses. Here's the line of the wall, so highlighting on the cursor. Where the wall crosses the Cambeck, which you can see is this lovely wooded beck stream. And in this section, effectively from the top of the photo to just above the fort, the beck itself is within a gorge. This is considered a minor river crossing for the wall compared to the very large rivers of the North Tyne or the Irthing. And none of these minor river crossings have ever really been archaeologically investigated. The issue here from a heritage at risk perspective is that the line of the wall is scheduled to either side of the beck. But there's a question about the beck itself. And again, there's some very soft natural sandstone bedrock here. Erosion and collapse is a very strong potential going forward. And without being able to predict when that will happen, what archaeological assets will be lost. And so that's what we are trying to investigate. Now, you can see here in the upper left-hand image, this is sitting at the beck itself. Across the image, here's the ditch, which is to the north of the wall. And the line of the wall is about where the cursor is here, where these trees are. It's a sizable gorge. It's at least 40 to 45 meters in width. And the height differential on the west bank is at least 12 meters from the base of the gorge up to the ground surface, the modern ground surface. So to say this is a minor river crossing is not to diminish the engineering challenge of taking a structure across. There is evidence within that gorge of some sort of Roman bridge works. There's this weir, which we know is there at least from the 18th century when we have first records of it being repaired, in which they found a Roman altar. And then if you look around, you can see other presumably Roman work stones. So this very water-worn voussoir from an arch, There's this lovely worked stone, which is actually over here at the west end of the weir, which has been, a bunch of Roman stones have been used to create a leat or a water channel. And a survey by late Peter Hill, who was a stonemason in 2011, he came up with this reconstruction of what a Roman bridge crossing that gorge may have looked like. We excavated on the eastern edge of that gorge on the line of the wall, as close as we really could without disturbing the root systems of the trees and the things that were protecting the slope into the gorge. I appreciate that to no one who spent weeks on this site, what you're seeing is a big red blob of soil. So the labels are there to help you. What I can show you is archaeology there. If you look at this site plan, and for those of you who aren't au fait with reading those sort of site plans, I'll walk you through it. There was a lot of robbing here. What we found was in situ remains of the rubble core of the wall and robber trenches for the removal of facing stones to the north and the south of the wall curtain. We found this rubble platform, a very degraded platform. This is just another structure. We also found evidence of a tower, a square tower, the square outline revealed again by stone robbing, but actually a very nice floor surface left in situ. When we did a trench through that, we also were able to find remains of the turf wall that was originally built in this section of Hadrian's wall. More surprising, however, was what we found south of the wall curtain, and this is a new one. We found a very sizable stone structure, what's being called Building 1 here. We had two sides of what appears to be a square tower feature, and which looks favorably comparable to similar structures that you'd see along the Rhine frontier. That we're projecting to that full size, but which fits quite nicely. And then we have this other structure, Building 2, which had a very nice clay floor surface and looked to have timber walling and beams rather than stone. We have C14 dates out of a number of these features. And so actually we have a very nice sequence in which Building 1, by both the pottery and the C14 dates and stratigraphic sequencing, links very nicely with the construction of the turf wall. And Building 2 seems to link very nicely with the reconstruction of the wall and turf in stone. We don't have substantial dates for this sort of probably foundation or the tower, but they are later, at least equal, if not later, to the rebuilding of the wall in stone here. And so our interpretation at present, sorry, that's to highlight those features for you, of the wall, foundation, a tower, stone tower, and then this detached tower and this other detached building. So our interpretation, if you think back to Peter Hill's interpretation on the upper left, is that we have something a bit more like this illustration by Matilda Grimaldi, in which we see the east bank being built up in height to the level of the much higher west bank. The phasing is also actually very similar to what we have in terms of evidence from major Hadrian's wall bridges in the work published by Bidwell in Holbrook, for example, over the North Tyne and the earthing. And so we think that that cobbly foundation is either a set of stairs or possibly a ramp, which is leading up to a tower, which leads to some sort of walkway across the wall. We didn't find the base of any pillars or piers in the river, in the gorge, unfortunately. But in terms of the distancing and then looking at the similar structures that we've had of other bridge crossings, those would be probably either 4 meters apart or 10 meters apart. And if 10 meters apart, it would only require 2 pillars and then the east and west bank. So we can plausibly reconstruct what that may have looked like. What would be very interesting to find out, and hopefully in future excavations, is if there's a matching tower on the west bank. And actually there's enough preservation there that we should be able to determine that. Moving on to the stone sourcing and dispersal bit. This is slightly less complicated, so we can talk through this a bit faster here. But there were 4 kind of focused activities that we were working on with our volunteers. One was to look at the natural geology. So we were doing geological walks, geological studies, where we were teaching them how to look at and interpret a rock sample. How do you physically describe and appropriately record geological samples, for example. Getting our volunteers to zoom in and look closely at rock as a material and appreciate actually the quite remarkable variation you get, even within sandstone. We also then looked at evidence for quarries, not just Roman quarries, but also post-Roman quarries to try and differentiate what were likely to be Roman quarries compared to medieval and early modern and modern quarries. We had them looking very directly at the wall. One of the best ways to train your volunteers in identifying wall stone is to get them to minutely record wall stone for endless hours, so that then when they walk around, they've been brainwashed to look at stones instead of the building as a whole. We didn't call it brainwashing, of course. It was training. But then also to take that experience and that knowledge and apply that to post-Roman structures, whether that's some of the churches and monastic remains in the area, farmhouses, castles, but to train their eye towards something that looks morphologically, by shape, like Roman stone, and then reinforce that with geological observation. What that did, and if we focus just, for example, upon the recording of wall stone, what that did is it gave us a lot of measurements of individual stones for Hadrian's Wall, many, many thousands of those. What some poor sucker, which was myself, had to do was then take all those measurements and start pulling together some averages. So we could put together tables like this. So across these sites that you see in various locations along Hadrian's Wall, arranged west to east, we could get an average size per stone per course of the wall and get a sense of the differential variation in building and in source fabric. So this looks very blah, I appreciate. But actually, we can then start applying that a little bit more creatively. So here are 3 examples of sites photographed here at Black Harts at Walltown, both in Northumberland, and the wall right east of Bradoswald in Cumbria. And those are all scaled at the same size. If you can reduce your brain from thinking about, oh, that's a lovely overall pattern, but actually look a bit more closely at the stone, the individual stones, you can see they're all built slightly different. The stones are not the same size across those 3 sites. And even within one site, there's quite a bit of difference. And of course, we know that there are at least 3 legions that were building the wall, not to mention 300 years afterwards, in which there's numerous repairs, which sometimes were by civilians. So there's going to be a range of building styles employed. But with those average stone sizes, we can start doing some interesting things. So the image on the right, for example, is showing you just that variation in the smallest stone and the largest stone at any given location. We can then do other creative things to think about that as a building style. And so one of the things you can point out, for example, is that at Bradoswald, it starts out with larger facing stones, like a good solid base, but actually you have a really nice leveling course with long flat slabs. You see something similar at Walltown, but instead of long flat slabs, they're using small square blocks. But the overall result is the same, that putting those stones together creates a more level course for the subsequent courses of stonework to go up. And so you can see these different building styles employed by building parties. We have taken geological samples to do geochemical analysis, and we have thin sections and petrography to try and link some of these locations to source geology. There's a challenge here because this is sandstone, and sandstones are very difficult to distinguish. And there's a whole geological history of how sandstones are formed that can explain why any one geological sandstone formation might have multiple types of sandstone within it. But that work is still kind of, we're confirming that and checking our findings on that. But that leads us a bit to think about the post-Roman wall, what that means. I would argue, in fact, that we see Hadrian's Wall, on the face of Hadrian's Wall, up to its glorious full height at many different locations. And here are a few of them in front of you now. It's just that we don't think of it as Hadrian's Wall. But let's explore that a little bit more. So first, we've pulled together resources, which is an estimated total of the buildings and various building complexes that are using stone within a 10-mile boundary of the wall. And those that definitely have confirmed Roman fabric, Roman stone in them, and those that don't. Now, you'll notice immediately that the east and west ends of Hadrian's Wall are not as well represented. That's partly because there's not as many surviving stone buildings there from antiquity. They're also just not as well explored. So you have greater survival in the central uplands, which shouldn't surprise anyone. Those are less urban areas and less arable agricultural areas. So there's less general destruction of those past structures. If we think about how that stone is reused across the different periods in the early medieval period, that stone use is almost exclusively limited to Christian foundations. So that's churches or monasteries in various forms. And just the various locations there highlighted in the image there showing you the crypt at Hexham Abbey, which is reusing decorated stone corbridge. So those are very obvious targets, but also quite limited. There's not that many. They're not using huge amounts of stone. If we fast forward to the Middle Ages, you have two large royal castles at each end of Hadrian's Wall, at Newcastle and at Carlisle. These undoubtedly have Roman fabric within them, but actually when you walk around them and survey them, there's not nearly as much Roman fabric as you might expect. If you stop and think about it a moment, that's really not surprising, partly because they're large castles, they're royal castles, but they're also occupied over many centuries. And there's lots of reworking, lots of rebuilding, lots of expansion. And then in Newcastle, especially, lots of destruction. And so you just got that constant cycle of development and rebuilding. So actually much of the Roman fabric at these two locations is probably under the ground still. More illuminating are the farmhouses and kind of small castles that we can associate with the Middle Ages and the early modern periods. So these are two examples, each within a mile of each other. There's the farmhouse, which is on the fort at Brodalswald itself, which started out as a late medieval defended solar or tower, hall block, whatever you prefer to call it. And over the years morphed into a more gentrified farm, and then subsequently just a good working farm in the later 19th and 20th centuries. And just slightly to the east, about half a mile, is the farm at Willowford, which is built directly on the line of the wall itself, which has Roman fabric clearly integrated into it, for example, in the form of centurial stone and inscriptions. These are very commonly found along the entire length of Hadrian's Wall. Now, we weren't able to go out and survey every farmhouse or to kind of peer through all the barns or even try and pull out some barn walls and see if there are new inscriptions to be found. But there's a massive amount here. So that leads to questions of, well, how much robbing of Hadrian's Wall was there? And for this, I would take you to two different sites. I'll give you another example of Drumbriff Castle, which is a early 14th century, really fortified hall block, but which is drawing more substantially probably on the Roman fort than the curtain of the wall itself. If we look at Lanercost Priory, however, what we have is a fantastic textual record for the priory itself. It's Augustinian, founded in 1169. And it's almost entirely constructed over the course of a century, from the 12th and 13th century. There's some building after that, but not substantial. It's then dissolved with other monasteries in 1538, and then it gets bought up and renovated by the Dacres, so a major family in Cumberland, who are the West Wardens of the Marches as well. And so it becomes an elite secular residence. You can see here from the lovely English Heritage phase plan that dating. If you look at the kind of the pinkish fuchsia color and the orange and the yellow, it is mostly, that construction is mostly occurring within the space of a century. And if you look at this image here on the right, you can see a really lovely consistent use of similarly sized shaped stones. One of the things I would point out is actually that separation of what's called a yellow or a gray sandstone and the red sandstone as well. This is almost all certainly wallstone. What's interesting though is that if you visit Hadrian's Wall, you don't see any of this red sandstone in situ. So it's by looking at some of the post-Roman structures that we can see hints of later Roman repairs and reworkings. Even more interesting though, that because of the Lanercost cartulary and records of land grants, we can actually trace the land holdings of the priory to its estates that had access, direct access and ownership of the wall itself. And so you can see on the map here, those areas highlighted in red of about 6 to 8 kilometers of Hadrian's Wall that the priory had direct access to for building. And even more interestingly and helpfully, we have inscriptions that we can link to very clear types of sites or locations. So for example, there's an altar, which is almost certainly from Brodalswald, based on the unit attested. There's another inscription, which is probably from a Mile castle, and we have at least 3 centurial stones that are taken from the curtain of the wall. So we can see that the priory is drawing upon these different sources over the course of a century, but also being selective, perhaps, in when it's building, if you consider this separation of color in the stonework as well for the building purpose. If we look at a much more modest site at Thirlwall Castle, again, this is another 14th century fortified structure, really a more defended hall block and solar than a castle proper, in replacing an earlier probably timber manor house. It was occupied until the 17th century and was never substantially refurbished across the 3 centuries that it was occupied, which is fantastically convenient, at least for us. The other thing I would point out is that the line of Hadrian's Wall is approximately 150 meters south of the castle where the cursor is now. So it's actually a really, really simple job to move the stone from the wall to this location for the building. Now you have this lovely, again, consistency of stone size and fabric that's not typical in castles. When you think of castles as multi-phase monuments, it's all very standardized at their wall. And that in itself makes it look slightly odd as a castle. It makes it brilliant for our purposes. So we can look at the castle and we can do some very crude math in terms of how much stone was required for its building. I say crude because it doesn't survive completely. So there has to be some estimation of its full height and internal walls for use of stone. But the total volume of stone required to build it is only about 2,600 cubic meters. And the area facing stone is about 1,000 square meters. The equivalent length material can be found in Hadrian's Wall, depending on how high we would project the full height of Hadrian's Wall, to some 200 to 330 meters. That's effectively the length of the wall inside this blue box. When you consider the size of the monument itself, and actually its access to the wall, that's not a lot. And that's a castle. Farmhouses are much more modest. What's interesting here is actually how little of that fabric is ultimately probably being robbed from the wall. And for those farmhouses, castles, and sites that are built on top of Roman forts, they're more likely taking that material from the forts, which will have a much wider range of stonework to borrow from. But we can go further. We can project back. The thickness of the walls at their wall are, when you measure them, the same thickness of Hadrian's Wall. I wonder if there's some either genius building or lazy building here, and that they simply took the facing stones and the rubble core down, and they put them back up at the same thickness when they built the castle. There's other aspects, the reused window heads, perhaps, coming from turrets. What we see is the coins on the corners actually fit very nicely in terms of size that you'll see with blocks at turrets in Lionel castles, as well as forts. The beveled stones at the top of the footings, for example, actually might be the inverted string course from the top of the wall curtain, separating a parapet from the wall facing. There's lots here, there's lots of potential in those post-Roman structures to actually start thinking much more architecturally and structurally about Hadrian's Wall. And so you can see, to some extent, what Hadrian's Wall would have looked like if we just spend a bit more time looking at the post-Roman and not obsessing about the Hadrianic. All these results will appear in 2 monographs. So we've got one focused on the heritage at risk work, another that's focused on the stone sourcing dispersal work, a number of papers in academic journals and books. And we also built, for the first time ever, a GIS, which brings together all the really nerdy information about Hadrian's Wall that wall dorks like myself get really excited about, like the thickness of the wall and mile castle type gateways and where they can be found, that is being deposited with ADS and will be on a web-based GIS interface. So anyone can have a play with it. And of course, all the underlying data can be downloaded for your own GIS use. But one of the other important aspects of the project were the exhibitions, of which we did 3. And we were able to experiment a bit here and help out some of our local museums by contributing to the permanent exhibitions at Tully House and at the Great North Museum in Newcastle. And one of the wonderful things we're able to do at the Great North Museum in Newcastle is use laser projection to try and reinterpret some of the stonework there. We took a small corner of the gallery with 7 altars and have a 5-minute cycle of laser light projection, which colorizes them in a kind of a realistic Roman color, but then also offers some animated interpretation as well for a lay audience to try and understand how these altars function in daily Roman life. And last but not least are the volunteers. One of the key things to come from this project actually is to think about how we as archaeologists and in the heritage sector interface with volunteers. And so it's really important, of course, lottery requires that we have an evaluation of the project, but it's also worth thinking about volunteers, volunteer barriers, volunteer needs, and why volunteers engage with archaeology and heritage. And so we have a lot of important data to share there. Because it's a lottery funded project, we had a development phase. So we ended the development phase with 130 registered volunteers, which meant when we started in the delivery phase of doing all the real hard work, we already started with more than 100 volunteers registered with us. Over the course of the project, that number grew every quarter, actually every month, in fact, up to the end of project where we had 407 registered volunteers. That's actually a minimal figure because some of those volunteers, it's one registration, but it accommodates a household of, say, a married couple or sometimes an entire family of parents and children. Sometimes it's one registration for a whole organization, like the Uzburn Trust, who are involved with this quite a bit. We also worked very hard to make sure that it wasn't what's called the typical volunteer audience. That's to say that, retired middle-class people, if we're being honest. And we tried to make sure that there were opportunities there for different demographics in people of different employment status to get involved. You can see from the pie graph there, it was still largely a retired audience. But actually what was great is by just thinking about the scheduling events, we were able to bring in different audiences by thinking about particular holidays in religious holidays besides those in the Christian calendar. We're also able to include different demographics from different parts, for example, of Greater Urban Tyneside. And you can see that those volunteers came from across the UK, primarily those counties that Hadrian's Wall runs through. But actually, because of some of the digital nature of the project, we were able to involve volunteers from a bit further afield. And we did a lot. We had over 6,350 participations. We had 309 events, and that's over 1,369 project days. So that was basically one event every 5 days. And that's to really reduce the amount of work I'm talking about. If you can imagine running an excavation for a month with 30 different volunteers showing up every day, that's really only counting as one event. So those numbers are masking actually a lot of work, very hard work that was done by the WallCAP team. But that was also part of the success of the engagement of the project. It's having something continually going on, but also it wasn't just field work. We had the geological side. We had a lecture series. We also had other offerings. For example, a WallCAP book club where we read books of various genres, some historical fiction, some crime thrillers, anything that moderately touched upon Hadrian's Wall or the heritage of the borders. And it wasn't meant to be deeply intellectual. It was just something to do that people felt connected and engaged with. We just had a simple online tea break that we instituted during COVID, just to help our volunteers stay in touch with each other. One of the things that we were able to do was offer training sessions for a lot of our volunteers. How do you use Zoom? And actually, one of the great bits of feedback we got is because of WallCAP, I could talk to my grandchildren in London. In some cases, this is just kind of life skills and kind of everyday engagements. And what we had to do is make sure that we could provide those and remove those barriers to access. And actually key to that was having a dedicated staff member who was there for the volunteers. Carrie Shaw, who's wonderful and does her job fantastically. She herself will say, I am not an archaeologist. I'm interested in the living, not in the dead. Her job was to be an advocate for the volunteers. And so when we were planning these activities, she would be the first one to say, wait a minute, that's not going to work for our volunteers because, and that was really important to hear that and to contest some of what I wanted to accomplish as an archaeologist. And that's another lesson I would very strongly advocate to anyone running this sort of community archaeology project. Invest in staffing for someone whose job it is to look after and care for those volunteers, because it also makes the job of the team, the rest of the team, much easier. And then finally, what we were also able to get was some evidence of how heritage contributes to well-being. Now, in this sense, for all the horrors of COVID, it was a little bit of a silver lining. And actually, it made very stark how wonderful it is to be able to go out in the world and do something. So we had a really great contrast delivered to us on a platter. It's not necessarily what we wanted, but it was something that really threw things into stark regard. So we found over the course of the project, we had a 96% overall satisfaction rate from project participants. But of those respondents, 95% of them claimed that the project had a very positive impact on their well-being. The graph on the right there showing what aspects of well-being we're talking about, and we asked them very specifically to break it down. So whether it's intellectual or mental stimulation, investment in a sense of place, social interactions. What it didn't do is reduce much of the stress or anxiety, but that might also be a reflection of the largest demographic of our group being retirees in that sense, who weren't trying to balance work jobs with digging as much. But everything else was much more positive. And I think increasingly we need to be thinking about this aspect of well-being and how heritage falls into it. We know that we're not curing cancer in archaeology. And so it's vitally important, of course, that doctors and medical researchers receive that funding. But actually, there's a place for the heritage sector and how much it enriches people's lives and gives them meaning beyond the everyday work. But thank you very much for your attention tonight.
Rob, that sort of really gives us an excellent example of not only involving people, but involving people in ways that they enjoy, but also produces excellent archaeological results. So, congratulations. Can I just ask one question before I open it up to the floor? I remember many years ago supervising Alan Whitworth on the reuse of stone for Hadrian's Wall. And in my sort of faint recollection of Alan's work, he pulled out a lot of reuse of stone in field walls and so forth.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you've done anything further on that and reflecting on what Alan found in that sort of western end of the wall.
Of course, yeah. Alan's work was instrumental, beyond a doubt. In his BAR, which publishes a lot of that thinking as well, has been a fantastic go-to throughout the project. And so I hope we're building upon his work rather than diminishing it in many ways. Alan's absolutely right. It's not just houses, barns, castles. It's field walls as well. I did have a play one day with our GPS, handheld GPS, while we were on site, and just kind of walked around where we were working and just kind of hit the button to log something every time I was at a spot where I saw reused wall stone. And it just resulted, as you can imagine, in this massive square of field walls around the field we were working in. I'm not sure it was necessarily productive. It would have been productive to do that. But I think what I would point to from this work that we need to maybe think about going forward is, because we're often very focused on protecting the Roman assets within planning speech, it's the development or redevelopment of standing buildings that we need to also pay a bit more attention to, and maybe need to think about safeguarding in World Heritage sites or sites where there's particularly special monuments. Because actually that, there was a number of farms that were redeveloped over the course of the project that I'm certain had wall stone, and there was nothing to safeguard that or make sure they were part of a watching brief in case a new inscription or a bit of sculpture came up. So there are lessons to learn, I think, from this.
Thank you. Can I open it up?
Small question, but why should there be the introduction of slabs in Bird Oswald's wall and no other wall, even if they are of the same height?
This is partly the different builders. So as I've said, you've got at least 3 different legions who are building Hadrian's Wall in the original Hadrianic period. Within those legions, you then have that broken down by cohorts and then centuries. And then within each century, different building parties in each century. To some extent, the sense of uniformity that we often apply to Hadrian's Wall is an illusion. And human brains are very good at not only detecting pattern, but also projecting pattern. And so those different legionary building parties, perhaps at the century level, are just building to a different style. As I'm sure that Matt can tell you, if you look at mile castles in detail, there's no 2 mile castles that look exactly alike. It's almost like they have a list of bullet points of what to build, but not architectural plans. And then if you start factoring in that different parts of the wall will have been built at different times, they'll have accessed different stone sources, where the quality of stone might dictate just how reasonably large a block could be. There's going to be quite a bit of variation there in style. So we need to look through, first we need to identify that diversity so we can start thinking through about why those different styles.
Yes, I can see the styles are different, but what I'm looking for is a function in the slab. I mean, if it's introducing a walkway or something of that sort, I can understand it, but otherwise I can't see the point of it.
It's actually
style, yes, but I mean, style is for a function.
Structurally, it can be quite important having that sort of leveling course. And one of the things that Peter Hill is quite keen to point out, and I'm having done this project, I'm completely on board with, is that Hadrian's Wall was built to a generally appalling standard and not built to actually a very good standard. And so things like a leveling course, every 5, 6, 7 courses would have been quite important. There's also, as you can imagine, in the north of England, a lot of ground isn't flat and level. There's a lot that's built on slope. And actually, when you start looking at those sections where it's built on slope, the coursing is terrible. It's, they've not really taken time to necessarily level out. Sometimes, as long as the slope isn't too steep, they're just building parallel with the slope, which isn't really good building at all. And you see that repeated at location after location. I'm not entirely convinced, I don't have data to back it up, but actually having looked at so much of the wall in scrutiny, I'm not entirely convinced that much of the wall that we see at present is actually purely Hadrianic in its build. I think the material, much of it probably is Hadrianic, but I'm not sure much of it is in the original position that the legionaries in the Hadrianic period put it in, as opposed to some later soldier repairing it.
Thanks, Rob. Excellent talk, very enjoyable. I particularly liked the illustration of the gradual destruction of the wall at Walltown. And there you see it standing to full wall walk height with the crenellations in 410. I was just wondering, did you get any positive evidence or even a strong sense from any of your work about whether or not the curtain is still regularly maintained along the line of Hadrian's Wall right through to the end, or if you're starting to see some of it being robbed or allowed to fall into disrepair earlier on?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. There's no solid dating evidence in the sense of a good piece of pottery, a coin, even a C14 date. But I think what's interesting is actually across a number of sites, the arrangement of the stones, the fabric, the building style, I think actually points more toward rebuilding. And so I suspect actually there's a lot more repair work of the wall in the Roman period than is acknowledged. We tend to think of it as an imperial project and therefore an imperial building program and imperial refurbishments and repairs under, say, Septimius Severus. I suspect actually there's lots of last minute repairs up to the point that they could afford to do so. And the recent excavations that have been published by Paul Bidwell in 2018 at Buttle Street and Wallsend show that very eloquently, that there were multiple collapses of the wall there because it was just poorly built on shoddy ground, on soft, sandy ground that kept collapsing. So we didn't see those multiple phases of collapse and rebuild at any of our sites. But actually, there's a number of locations, and the turret at Denton is a really good example. Simply by looking at that for 5 minutes, I've realized that turret has collapsed and been rebuilt. And that's nowhere in the literature. And it only took a few minutes of direct observation to tease out the building's archaeology. And that's not untypical for many sites. So I can't say right up to the end of the Roman period, but my suspicion is that actually they're very active in maintaining that structure.
My question was much the same as the last one, actually. Has any of the field work revealed anything new about the end of the wall, occupation, or kind of the last phases of occupation as we run through the 5th and even into that murky 6th century? Anything there?
Yeah, sadly, no, because that's my real love of Hadrian's Wall, as it were. I was hoping we'd find some fantastic burials or something. Sadly, we didn't. But I think what I would say we have found is a much longer and more enriched post-Roman life to the wall. I think at all those sites where we excavated, where we have evidence for demolition and destruction, which is really important because it's not often examined from that perspective. Most of that demolition destruction is post-medieval. Where there's active medieval destruction, it's almost always to build a very local big thing, as it were. So the most widespread destruction is post-medieval and early modern. So in that sense, if we think through that a little bit, I think that means we can very confidently say the wall is a much more enduring and probably influential monument through the early Middle Ages than is often given credit for. And we can see hints of that in texts. For example, when in Bede, when we hear about Oswald waiting to front Godolphin's army, he's camping at Heaven Gate, which is just north and east up the hill from Chester's. He's picked a great spot to intercept his enemy, depending on whether they go up the River North Tyne or up Deer Street. And the wall is therefore also protecting his flank at the same time. There are some hints that the news that just come out about the site in Northumberland, where there's evidence for the Viking Great Army being encamped. That Roman infrastructure is really strongly influencing those post-Roman centuries. And if we're not seeing that widespread destruction until the very late medieval period, early modern period, then what you have is, even if it's a massive earthen mound and it looks more like Offa's Dyke, that's still shaping how people are moving through the landscape. And so I think with more targeted selective excavation, I suspect we'll find probably much more early medieval engagement with the wall. That's always my hope.
Thank you.
In which case, can we express our thanks again to Rob for a very stimulating paper that I think has given a lot of impetus to the involvement of volunteers. What you were showing at the end with how that feeds back is something that's a useful lesson to us all. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone.
I give notice that the next ordinary meeting, Thursday, the 10th of November at 5 p.m, we'll hear a paper by Professor Ian Armett, Fellow, Migration, Mobility and Demography in Later Prehistoric Britain. Can I just say that we're aware that there is a tube strike next Thursday, but we are going to do the meeting in person as well as online for those of you who can walk from the station or whatever, which is what I'm going to do. Meeting stands adjourned.